My son-in-law kicked me out, and my daughter cuffed me off for 7 years. I bill a $10 million in fine. They show up at my mansion. Hi, welcome to my channel. Here's my new story.
My son-in-law turned my own daughter against me to the point that they cut off all contact with me for 6 years. They believed I had died somewhere in loneliness and poverty. But then my small business suddenly took off and I bought a large mansion. One day they showed up at my door, suitcases in hand, fake smiles on their faces. "Mom, your house is so big. Let us move in with you." For 10 years they treated me like trash. Now they want the keys to my mansion. But what they don't know, that door doesn't lead to forgiveness. It's the beginning of the price they're about to pay. Thank you for being here. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Also, please note this story may include fictionalized elements for storytelling and reflection. Any resemblance to real people or places could be coincidental, but the message is meaningful. The moment Marcus Sterling threw my vintage leather suitcase onto the wet pavement, I realized that 12 years of maternal devotion had just been appraised at exactly $0. I stood there 75 years old and shivering in a rain-slicked Sunday dress, watching my own daughter's husband lock the door of the house I had helped them buy. If you were looking at me, then you would have seen a broken woman, a discarded relic of a life that no longer had a place in the modern world. But today, as I stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Savannah library, I am no longer that ghost. I, Eleanor Beaumont, have spent the last decade building an empire out of the very dirt they pushed me into. My pearls today hide the scars of a year spent sleeping on bus benches, and my $10 million net worth is a fortress Marcus Sterling will never breach. Success is the best revenge, as they say, but I have learned that justice is the only thing that actually lets me sleep at night. My journey from the gutter to this mansion started with rain betrayal and exactly $847 left in a tattered silk purse. Have you ever looked into the eyes of a child you birthed and seen a total stranger? It's colder than any grave. That is exactly what I saw on October 3rd, 2013. I was in the kitchen of the Sterling residence drying a tea towel when Marcus Sterling, a 30-year-old logistics manager with a smile as bright and empty as a vacant lot, walked in. He didn't look at me with the usual feigned politeness of a son-in-law. He looked at me like a piece of furniture that had begun to smell. He handed me a cardboard box that had already been taped shut at the bottom. He told me I had 2 hours to vanish because my presence was toxic and was unraveling his marriage. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked past him into the hallway where Victoria Sterling, my only daughter at 24, stood in the shadows. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her vibrant spirit, the one I had nurtured through every scraped knee and broken heart, was already dimmed to a flicker. I begged her to say something, to remember that I was her mother, the woman who had stayed awake through her fevers and worked 3 jobs to pay for her tuition. She only whispered that she couldn't choose me over him. Marcus didn't wait for my tears to dry. He moved with a clinical, terrifying efficiency, already sliding my coat off the rack and holding it out like a polite executioner. He told me he had already called a taxi and that any delay would result in him calling the police to report a trespasser. Click. That was the sound of my digital life dying as Marcus hit deactivate on his iPad, showing me the screen where my name was being scrubbed from their family cell phone plan. He took my phone right out of my hand, claiming it was his property since he paid the monthly bill. I was being erased in real time. I packed what I could fit into 2 bags, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely pull the zippers. As I stepped onto the porch, the Georgia sky opened up, dumping a cold gray deluge onto the driveway. Marcus set my bags at the edge of the stairs and stood there with his arms crossed, a man who had just successfully removed a stain from his carpet. From the upstairs window, I heard the muffled, high-pitched wail of 3-year-old Olivia Sterling. She was gripping her teddy bear, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't yet name, screaming for her Nana. Marcus didn't even flinch. He reached back and slammed the heavy oak door, the sound echoing through the neighborhood like a gunshot. The metallic click of the deadbolt was the final period on my life as a grandmother. I carried my bags to the curb, the weight of the water making my clothes feel like lead. I didn't have a car, and the taxi Marcus claimed to have called never arrived. I walked 4 blocks to the nearest bus stop, my shoes squelching in the mud, feeling the cold, unyielding weight of my late husband's diamond ring on my trembling hand. It was the only thing Marcus hadn't managed to take yet. I wasn't just a woman on a bus. I was a dormant seed being pressed into the mud, waiting for the season to bloom through the concrete. When the city bus finally wheezed to a stop, the driver didn't even look at me as I climbed the steps, dripping water onto the floorboards. I sat in the back, clutching my purse against my chest, and opened my wallet to count what was left. $847. It was a joke. It was the price of a mid-range television or a weekend getaway, yet it was now the entire sum of my existence. As the bus pulled away, I watched the neighborhood where I had spent the last 8 months vanish into the mist of the downpour. I looked at the dark houses and the manicured lawns, realizing that Marcus had planned this for months. He hadn't just wanted me out of his house, he wanted me erased from the world. He had spent weeks slowly draining the small savings account I had kept in my maiden name, claiming it was for Victoria's medical expenses, only to leave me with this pittance. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended the moment that door slammed. I looked at the meager stack of 20s in my lap and felt a spark of something hotter than rage. Marcus Sterling thought he had reduced me to ash, but he had actually given me the greatest gift of all. He had made me invisible. He left me alive, and that was his one fatal mistake. I am Eleanor Beaumont, and I am the evidence he could never truly delete. The city bus door wheezed open at the edge of the industrial district, releasing me into a world that smelled like wet pavement and the sharp chemical tang of industrial cleaner. I stepped down onto the cracked sidewalk, my rain-soaked Sunday dress clinging to my skin like a second colder layer of grief. I had looked at the meager stack of 20s in my lap and realized Marcus had made one fatal mistake. He left me alive. But as I stood under the flickering purple light of a dying neon sign, that survival felt like a heavy, mocking burden. The sign above the entrance buzzed with a rhythmic, insect-like persistence, spelling out Azalea Motor Lodge in a hue that made the rain look like falling oil. I adjusted the strap of my vintage suitcase, the leather slick and heavy, and pushed through the glass door into the lobby. The air inside was thick with the scent of menthol cigarettes and a desperate attempt to mask mold with lemon-scented bleach. Behind a counter, protected by a scratched plexiglass shield, sat Arlo, the desk clerk at the Azalea, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment and who smelled perpetually of the stale tobacco clinging to his flannel shirt. He didn't look up from his crossword puzzle as I approached, dripping a trail of Savannah rainwater onto his grimy linoleum floor. When I cleared my throat, he finally raised eyes that were weary and predatory all at once, scanning my wet. Expensive clothes with a sneer that told me he knew exactly what kind of disaster I was fleeing. 43 a night, he grumbled, his voice like gravel in a tin can. Cash up front for your kind. I reached into my purse, my fingers numb, as I pulled out 2 of my precious 20s and 3 singles. I have the money, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I just need a door that locks. Arlo snatched the bills, his yellowed fingernails grazing my palm. You look like you fell off a yacht and hit the gutter, lady, he muttered as he slid a bent brass key labeled 104 across the counter. Room 104 was at the end of a long, dimly lit walkway where the shadows seemed to pulse with the buzzing light. Have you ever tasted the metallic tang of fear? It tastes exactly like cheap motel tap water and the copper realization that you are truly alone. Inside the room was a symphony of beige failures. A single bed with a floral spread that had faded into the color of a bruise sat under a window that looked out onto a brick wall. I set my suitcase down and walked to the cracked porcelain sink, trying to wash the Savannah mud from my hem, but the water ran rust red for the first minute, staining the basin. I looked into the mirror at the woman Marcus Sterling had tried to erase and saw a ghost in a Sunday dress haunting a lobby that didn't believe in spirits. My daughter, my Victoria, was likely sleeping in 1,000-thread count Egyptian cotton at that very moment, while I was calculating if I could afford a second week of this purgatory. I couldn't stay in that silence. I needed to hear her voice to believe that the woman who had watched me be exiled wasn't the daughter I had raised. I walked back out into the parking lot, the rain now a dull drizzle, and found the motel's rusted payphone near the vending machines. I pulled the emergency-only contact list Marcus had tucked into my bag out of my pocket, hoping for a name a tether to my old life. But as I scrolled through the handwritten names, my heart sank. These weren't friends or family. They were Marcus's business associates, men who worked in his logistics warehouse and viewed me as an inconvenience to be managed. Click. The dial tone died before I could even finish the sequence for Victoria's number. My last tether to my daughter's voice vanished into a recorded message informing me that the number was no longer in service. He hadn't just disconnected my line, he had changed hers. I felt a surge of cold, calculated fury replacing the initial shock. I left my bags in the room and walked 3 blocks to a small branch library I had noticed from the bus. I sat at a communal computer, my wet clothes drawing glares from the students nearby, and tried to log into my personal savings account. It was a modest sum, less than $5,000, kept in my maiden name, but it was my escape fund. The screen flickered, the cursor spinning in a mocking circle, before the text appeared in bold blood-red letters. Access denied. Contact account administrator. I sat back, the plastic chair creaking under my weight. Marcus hadn't just taken my home, he had taken my name, my money, and my history. He was systematically killing the person I was making sure I had no path back to the world he wanted to own. I wasn't just homeless, I was being professionally unmade. I looked at the black screen, seeing my own reflection in the glass, a woman with nothing left but her mind. Marcus thought he had trapped me in a cage of poverty, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had taught him how to read a balance sheet. He was playing a game of logistics, but I was about to start a war of attrition. I walked back to the azalea, my mind working through the numbers, the assets, and the secrets Marcus thought he had buried. He had left me in the dirt, but he forgot that I was a gardener. I knew how to wait for the rot to become fertilizer. As I reached the door to room 104, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked into the side pocket of my suitcase that must have fallen from the box Marcus gave me. It was a note in his precise, slanted handwriting. It warned me that if I contacted child services or tried to see the kids, he would use his connections to ensure I was institutionalized for my mental instability. I wasn't just a ghost to him, I was a loose end he intended to tie off. The bank screen had blinked red, signaling my financial death, but as I turned the key in the lock, I knew Marcus had made a mistake. He had given me a room with a door that locked, and that was all the space I needed to plan his ruin. The morning sun was too bright for a woman with $800 and no future. I stood in front of Palmer's Petals, my cracked fingernails digging into my palms, as I looked at the help wanted sign taped to the glass. The bank screen had blinked red, confirming my financial death, but the adrenaline of a survivor was beginning to hum in my veins. I smoothed my damp Sunday dress, took a breath of the humid savanna air, and pushed open the door. The chime above me announced my arrival to a shop that smelled cloyingly of overripe lilies and the biting cold of a walk-in cooler. Mrs. Palmer was a woman who looked like a pressed wildflower, fragile at a glance, but with a stem made of iron and dirt under her fingernails. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the quality of my shoes and the ruin of my hem. I didn't give her time to reject me. I don't need sympathy, Mrs. Palmer, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet of the morning. I need a broom. She started to speak, likely a polite dismissal, but I pointed toward the back cooler. You're over-ordering lilies by 20%. The rot in your back cooler is costing you a mortgage payment each month. You're also pricing your orchids based on 2010 margins. She blinked, her iron gray brows rising. How do you know that I worked for my husband, Bill Beaumont, for decades? And I taught him everything he knew about logistics and inventory. I'm more qualified than the man currently trying to erase me. Mrs. Palmer studied me for a long minute before handing me a coarse broom. Start at the back, she said. Try not to get your fancy dress dirty. Do you know what $15 an hour feels like when you used to spend that on a single silk napkin? It feels like freedom. For the next month, I became the shadow of Palmer's Petals. I swept floors, prepped stems until my fingers bled and stayed invisible. I was a ghost in a Sunday dress, but I was a ghost with a growing ledger. By December, Savannah was thick with wedding season. A week before Christmas, a frantic bride and her mother burst into the shop. The Vanderbilt name was one I recognized from my former life-old money-high expectations. Their lead wedding coordinator had walked off the job 4 hours before the reception at a historic district mansion. Mrs. Palmer was pale, clutching a clipboard as if it could save her. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I'm just a florist." I stepped forward, discarding my apron. "Step back, Mrs. Palmer. I'll handle the Vanderbilts." Panic is a wildfire, and I was the cold, gray rain that had finally arrived to put it out. I didn't explain. I didn't ask permission. I grabbed the bride's shaking hands and told her she would be walking down the aisle in a perfect ballroom, or I'd personally burn the mansion down. I took command of the vendors with a terrifying efficiency that only comes from having nothing left to lose. When I arrived at the mansion, it was a disaster of half-set tables and missing fish courses. I remained invisible to the guests, acting as the hired help, despite knowing their world better than they did. "You catering lead, the fish is late." I barked, cornering a man twice my size in the kitchen. "Fix it or you don't get paid." When the florist delivery arrived, I saw a seating chart disaster that would have placed feuding cousins at the same table. I fixed it in 12 minutes. "Don't look at me," I told the frantic maid of honor. "Look at the timeline. We have 12 minutes to reset this foyer." The weight of that responsibility was heavier than any diamond I'd ever worn. It was the weight of a weapon, and I was learning how to aim it. By midnight, the wedding was a triumph. The bride wept with joy, and the mother of the bride tried to press a $100 bill into my hand. I declined, pointing her instead to Mrs. Palmer. I returned to the shop to help with the breakdown, my feet throbbing and my back screaming. Mrs. Palmer was waiting for me. She didn't ask questions this time. She handed me an envelope that felt substantial. "You saved that girl's life today, Eleanor." "Who are you, really?" I looked at her, the reflection of my tired 75-year-old face in the shop window, looking more like a warrior than a victim. "I'm the woman who's going to make sure the next wedding I plan is Marcus Sterling's funeral." Inside the envelope was $700, the shop's commission, plus a personal tip the bride had insisted on. I counted the crisp bills, the snap of the paper sounding like a gunshot in the quiet shop. My mind was a vault Marcus couldn't empty, and I had just found the key. As I began to clean up for the night, I noticed the trash bin near the front desk. On top was a discarded invitation, gold embossed and heavy. It was an invitation to Marcus and Victoria's upcoming anniversary gala. They were celebrating the life they had stolen from me, inviting the very people who used to call me friend. They were replacing my social spot as if I had never existed. I picked up the invitation, my fingers tracing the raised ink of Marcus's name. He thought he had buried me, but he had only provided the soil. The $700 in my pocket was just the beginning. I looked at the crumpled invitation in the trash and smiled. If Marcus wanted a gala, I was going to give him one he'd never forget. But the true turning point came 3 weeks later in December 2016. I was coordinating a lavish Christmas wedding at the historic Telfair Mansion. The bride was a sweet woman in her early 30s, glowing with happiness. During the reception, I overheard her talking to her maid of honor near the champagne table. "I just wish my mother could have been here," the bride said, her voice wistful. But David's mother said it was either his family or mine. She told him I had to choose. The maid of honor frowned. That's not normal, Sarah." The bride shrugged, uncomfortable. "David says his mom knows what's best for our marriage. She's helping us with the down payment on the house, so I can't really argue. Mom understands. At least I hope she does. I haven't spoken to her in 6 months." My blood ran cold. I saw Victoria in that bride's face, the forced smile, the rationalization, the slow isolation. I watched the rest of the reception with new eyes. The groom's mother held court at the head table, her hand possessively on her son's arm. The bride's side of the room was noticeably empty, only a handful of cousins, no parents, no siblings. I recognized the pattern because I had lived it. Marcus had done the same thing to Victoria, cutting her off from me, from her friends, from anyone who might question his control. That night, I went back to my apartment and pulled out every wedding contract I'd worked in the past 2 years. I started making notes, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might link Marcus to the larger Savannah social network. That's when I founded a name on a vendor list from Victoria's 2012 wedding. The photographer was a man named James Crawford, but the signature on the contract didn't match the work samples I'd found online. The real James Crawford was a private investigator who occasionally did wedding photography as a side business. Why would a PI be at my daughter's wedding unless someone had hired him to document something? I stayed up all night, coffee growing cold on my desk, searching public records and business registries. By sunrise, I had a theory Marcus had hired Crawford to surveil Victoria's family and friends before the wedding, identifying threats and weaknesses. If Marcus had used Crawford once, that meant Crawford had seen the red flags too. And if he'd seen them, maybe he'd kept records. The letter from room 104 arrived the next morning as if the universe was confirming my instincts. But I was already decided. I picked up my phone and called the number listed on James Crawford's business website. "Mr. Crawford," I said when he answered, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "My name is Eleanor Beaumont. You worked my daughter's wedding in 2012, and I believe you know exactly who I am and why I'm calling." There was a long pause. Finally, Crawford's gravelly voice came through the line. "Mrs. Beaumont, I've been wondering when you'd surface. We need to meet." That conversation led to the coffee shop in January 2017, the moment when my survival story officially became a war plan. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a fortress out of broken flowers and spite, and Marcus Sterling had no idea that the woman he'd left in the rain was about to become the most dangerous person in Savannah. The world tried to throw me away like yesterday's garbage, but they didn't realize I was the kind of treasure that only shines brighter under pressure. I sat in the fluorescent gloom of the Savannah County Clerk's office, signing Beaumont luxury events into existence while the man behind the desk looked at my Azalea Motor Lodge address like it was a contagious disease. I didn't blame him for the sneer, but I didn't internalize it either. I had looked at the crumpled invitation in the trash at Palmer's Petals and realized that if Marcus wanted a gala, I was going to give him one he'd never forget. But first, I needed a name that carried weight, a legal shield that Marcus couldn't pierce with a single phone call. I used $500 of my wedding bonus to secure my legal standing, officially registering the LLC. I spent my afternoons at the public library crafting a professional digital facade. To the world of the internet, I wasn't a woman living in room 104. I was an exclusive boutique event architect. I specifically chose the Azalea because it was miles outside Marcus's usual logistics routes and warehouse districts. I knew his routines better than he did, and I knew he would never accidentally spot me while I was still in the vulnerable stages of my rebirth. "I don't need a storefront to sell a dream, sir," I told the clerk when he questioned my lack of a commercial lease. "I just need this stamp. If people see the motel on my ID, the doors stay shut. If they see the Beaumont name, they open. A business is like a garden in a drought. You either carry the water yourself, gallon by agonizing gallon, or you watch everything you love turn to dust." Throughout 2014, I carried the water. I hustled through 16 weddings, taking on the roles of planner-designer and even waitress to save every cent. I became a master of the Instagram illusion. I built a 15,000-follower presence by staging luxury vignettes in public parks. I would take Mrs. Palmer's discarded exotic blooms flowers that were slightly wilted but still held their architectural beauty and arrange them against the moss-draped oaks of Forsyth Park. "Take the photo from this angle, Mrs. Palmer," I would say as she helped me steady a tripod. It hides the fact that we're in a public park and makes it look like a private estate. By the end of the year, I had $18,000 saved. It was a drop in the bucket compared to the life Marcus was currently living on my daughter's dime, but the bucket was finally starting to fill. 6 figures. The number stared back at me from the library computer screen in mid-2015. Revenue had hit $127,000. I finally allowed myself to walk back to the Azalea Motor Lodge one last time, not to pay for a week, but to collect my bags. I moved into a small but elegant studio apartment in the historic district that doubled as my first official office. No more industrial bleach, no more flickering neon or Arlo's menthol smoke. Just the smell of fresh linen and the sound of my own keys turning in a lock I owned. I spent my evenings staring at the blue-lit smartphone screen in the dark, watching Victoria's social media. I saw her at a gala I had been rejected from coordinating just months prior, smiling beside Marcus. He looked prosperous. She looked like a statue. It fueled a fire in me that no amount of success could dampen. I booked 32 weddings for the upcoming season. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was a competitor in the Savannah social market. Do you know what is more intoxicating than a vintage Bordeaux? The realization that you are becoming the very thing your enemies fear most, a witness with resources. As 2015 closed, the Beaumont brand was officially too big for one pair of hands. I moved into a dedicated office space with high ceilings and crown molding a far cry from the cracked sink of room 104. I hired my first assistant, a young woman who only knew me as the formidable Mrs. Beaumont. "We need a second assistant immediately," I told her, as I hung a heavy velvet curtain over the window. "Look at them," I whispered to myself, staring at a printout of Marcus and Victoria at the annual logistics ball. They're smiling in a ballroom they didn't earn. Next year, I'll be the one owning the room. The transition from survivor to CEO felt complete, a transformation that had taken every ounce of my steel and every lesson Bill had ever taught me. I was an asset now, a woman of means and reputation. But as I sat in my new office, the heavy scent of cardstock and printer ink surrounding me, my assistant brought in the morning mail. On top of the stack was a single cheap envelope. It wasn't an inquiry or a bill. It was addressed to the woman in room 104, a place I hadn't stepped foot in for over 6 months. My fingers trembled as I reached for the letter. The digital veil I had spent 2 years weaving suddenly felt as thin as gauze. I realized that while I had been building my empire, I had also been being watched. I discovered that one of my most loyal anonymous Instagram followers, a person who had been feeding me industry gossip and Marcus's movements for months, was actually a disgruntled former employee Marcus had fired in a fit of rage. They weren't just a fan, they were a source. But this letter was different. It was a physical reminder that the past was not as buried as I hoped. I stood at my window looking out over the city I was slowly reclaiming. I had the money, I had the name, and I had the drive. But Marcus was still out there, and he was starting to realize that the ghost he had created wasn't staying in the grave. The letter was a warning, and I knew exactly what my next move had to be. It was time to stop just building a business and start building a case. I was going to find the rot beneath Marcus Sterling's perfect life, and I was going to expose it to the light of day. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a character assassination, a vacuum where your reputation used to be, and I was currently standing right in the middle of it. The letter had arrived like a jagged stone thrown through a window, addressed simply to the woman in room 104. Even as I sat in my new executive suite surrounded by the smell of high-grade cardstock and fresh success, that address pulled me back to the grit of the Azalea Motor Lodge. I opened the cheap yellowed envelope to find an anonymous warning. It wasn't about my business, it was about my life. The scrawl informed me that Marcus Sterling was actively spreading a narrative through the Savannah social circuits that I had suffered a mental break after Bill died and was currently wandering the streets homeless and delusional. "He's not just replacing me," I whispered to the empty room, my fingers tightening on the paper. "He's burying me while I'm still breathing." I realized then that my digital veil, the prestigious Beaumont name I had built, was a shield, but it wasn't a sword. Marcus was actively hunting my social ghost, ensuring that if I ever tried to return to the world of the living, no one would believe a word I said. Have you ever heard your own eulogy while you were still standing in the room? It's surprisingly educational. It reveals exactly who was your friend and who was just waiting for your seat to become vacant. To test the depth of the rot, I coordinated a massive winter gala at the historic Savannah Theater. I stayed behind the scenes, a shadow in a black blazer, adjusting silk linens and whispering to caterers. In the lull before the main course, I stood behind a heavy velvet curtain and overheard a group of my former peers. These were women I had hosted, women whose children I had helped secure internships. They were laughing about my sad breakdown. One mentioned that Marcus had told them I was last seen wandering a bus station talking to myself. Poor Eleanor, they sighed their pity, sounding like the wheeze of a leaking tire. It was a tragic end for a woman of her standing. Rage boiled under my skin, but I forced it down into a cold, hard knot of resolve. Let them pity the ghost. The woman they're talking about died in the rain. This one is much more dangerous. Marcus Sterling's logistics background made him an expert at moving assets and hiding trails, but I knew he was arrogant. He thought a 75-year-old widow was a problem he had already solved with a bus ticket and a frozen bank account. Laughter. That was the sound of my life becoming a punchline for women who used to beg for my guest list. It was the final push I needed. If I was going to dismantle a man who lived in the shadows, I needed someone who was comfortable in the dark. In early January 2017, the Savannah air was sharp enough to cut, matched only by the chill in my heart. I sat in a nondescript coffee shop on the edge of the historic district, the smell of burnt grease and cheap beans, a sharp contrast to the high society galas I now orchestrated. James Crawford, 52, a private investigator who looked like he'd been folded too many times, creased weary, but with eyes that caught every lie before it left your lips, sat across from me. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had seen the worst of humanity and kept the receipts. I slid a heavy envelope containing a $3,000 cash retainer across the table. The $3,000 wasn't just paper. It was the first brick in the wall I was building around Marcus Sterling. I don't want a divorce lawyer, I told him, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. I want a wrecking ball. You're paying a lot of money for a ghost hunt, Mrs. Beaumont Crawford, replied, his voice a low rumble. Most people in your position just want to move on. I leaned forward, the heat of the coffee cup seeping into my palms. Trust me, Mr. Crawford, Marcus Sterling isn't a ghost. He's a predator. And he's currently holding my daughter and grandchildren hostage in a life built on my husband's legacy. Crawford studied me for a long minute, his gaze weighing my steel against my age. He didn't see a victim. He saw a client with a purpose. He reached out and pulled the envelope toward him, but he didn't put it in his pocket. Instead, he delivered the first twist of the knife. I discovered that the anonymous letter wasn't from a rival, but from Arlo, the motel clerk at the Azalea. He had recognized Marcus's car scouting the motel parking lot weeks after I had moved out. Marcus hadn't just been lying about my whereabouts. He had been looking for me, checking room 104 to see if I was still rotting where he'd left me. Crawford slid the envelope back toward me. He looked for you for 6 months, Eleanor. The question isn't why he couldn't find you, it's what he was planning to do if he did. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter wind outside. The revelation that my son-in-law had been hunting me while I was building my empire changed the game entirely. I wasn't just seeking justice. I was in a race for survival. But then Crawford dropped the final bomb, the one that made the coffee shop feel like it was spinning. I already know who Marcus Sterling is, James said, his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. Because Marcus Sterling tried to hire me to find you a year ago. He wanted me to track you down so he could ensure your well-being. But his requirements were all about your medical records and your legal power of attorney. My breath hitched. He hadn't been looking for a mother-in-law. He had been looking for a corpse to sign a deed. I looked at Crawford, realizing I had found the right man for the job. He had already seen the mask Marcus wore, and he was ready to help me tear it off. We sat in that quiet booth, two hunters beginning a season that would end in blood or bars. Marcus Sterling thought he had deleted me, but I was about to become the one thing a logistics expert can't manage, a variable that refuses to be solved. James Crawford didn't waste time. 3 weeks after our meeting, he slid a manila folder across his scarred oak desk, and for the first time in 70 years, I felt my blood turn to actual ice. I had spent those 3 weeks maintaining the facade of a thriving event planner, but every smile I gave a client felt like a mask held together by sheer willpower. Crawford looked at me with those weary, vigilant eyes and didn't offer any comforting platitudes. He knew I didn't come to him for comfort. I came for the truth, no matter how jagged it was. Marcus Sterling is a ghost, Mrs. Beaumont. He began, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He was born in a courtroom in Ohio exactly 7 years ago. He uncovers a name change filing that predates Marcus's arrival in Savannah. I stared at the legal seal on the document, my vision blurring for a second. Who was he? Before I asked, my voice barely a whisper. A man named Martin Steele Crawford replied, and Martin Steele has a very messy trail. I realized then that my daughter hadn't married a man. She had married a construction of legal paperwork. Crawford revealed that Marcus's supposedly prestigious logistics degree was also a fabrication. He had stolen the identity of a deceased classmate to build a resume that would pass a standard background check. Click. My brain finally connected the dots. The man my daughter loved was a professional predator who had spent years perfecting his camouflage. I opened the folder to find Martin Steele's history, and the first thing I saw was a wedding photo from 2007. It wasn't Victoria. It was a woman named Sandra Morrison, a successful architect who had inherited nearly $500,000 after her parents died in 2006. The file described a marriage that lasted less than 2 years. Sandra's entire inheritance money meant to secure her future had vanished within 18 months of the wedding. He didn't just spend it, I muttered, reading through the bank statements Crawford had managed to obtain. He liquidated her life. He had convinced her to invest in ventures that were nothing more than black holes designed to swallow her assets. How many lives can a man erase before the world notices the holes he leaves behind? I looked at Sandra's photo. She looked vibrant, intelligent, and completely unaware that she was being systematically dismantled. The horror deepened as Crawford presented the police report from March 13, 2009. Sandra Morrison was found at the bottom of her basement stairs. Martin Steele had been the one to call 911, his voice reportedly thick with grief, as he told the operator his wife must have tripped. They ruled it accidental because there were no witnesses and no signs of a struggle. But Crawford pointed to a specific date in the file. She died just 2 days before her scheduled divorce hearing. 2 days before the divorce. That's not a coincidence, Crawford. That's a deadline. By dying, she ensured that Martin Steele remained the sole beneficiary of a $300,000 life insurance policy. If she had lived 48 hours longer, he would have walked away with nothing but a lawsuit. Sandra Morrison was the first draft. My Victoria is the final copy he intends to shred. I felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck, the kind of visceral reaction your body has when it recognizes a predator nearby. I realized that the timeline of Sandra's marriage perfectly mirrored Victoria's current situation. Marcus had entered Victoria's life when she was at her most vulnerable, just like Sandra. He had isolated her, seized control of the finances, and was now reaching the end of the liquidation phase. Eleanor discovered that Marcus's computer at his old firm had been flagged for searching lethal dose of insulin just weeks before Sandra died, though it was never used in the official investigation. The pattern was identical. He wasn't just a thief, he was a harvester of souls. I looked at the grainy texture of the black and white photocopied police report, the high-pitched hum of the fluorescent light overhead, feeling like a drill in my temple. Crawford, I whispered, staring at Sandra's death certificate until the ink blurred. How much life insurance does Victoria have? Crawford didn't look up from his screen, his silhouette dark against the window. $500,000, Eleanor. And Marcus just upped the premium 3 months ago. The bitter taste of bile rose in my throat. My daughter wasn't just his wife, she was his next payout. He wasn't waiting for me to fade away. He was clearing the path so that when Victoria had her accident, there would be no one left to ask the difficult questions. I stood up my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. I couldn't go back to my office and pretend to care about centerpieces or seating charts. I had to move. I had to reach the people Marcus had hurt before he could finish what he started with my family. Rachel Morrison, Sandra's sister, was the only name Crawford had found that hadn't been silenced. She had been trying to prove Martin Steele was a killer for nearly a decade. I needed her. The drive to Atlanta was the longest 4 hours of my life, my mind playing a loop of Victoria's wedding day, Marcus's empty smile, and the sound of that basement door closing in a house 10 years ago. I am Eleanor Beaumont, and I have spent my life organizing the perfect day for others. But now I was going to organize the most chaotic day of Marcus Sterling's life. He thought he was the only one who knew how to manage a deadline, but he was about to find out that a mother's clock never stops ticking. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned the color of bone the 4-hour drive to Atlanta, feeling like a journey into a graveyard I wasn't ready to excavate. The rain-slicked asphalt of Interstate 16 stretched out before me, a gray ribbon cutting through the Georgia pines, but all I could see was the ghost of Sandra Morrison and the vibrant, living face of my daughter Victoria. James Crawford's words echoed in the cabin of my car like a death knell $500,000. That was the price Marcus Sterling, or rather the man born Martin Steele, had placed on my daughter's heartbeat. It was a cold, calculated valuation that I knew all too well from my years in logistics. But seeing it applied to my own flesh and blood made the metallic taste of fear-induced dry mouth almost unbearable. I mentally audited my own growth against Marcus's predatory timeline. He thought he had discarded me, a 75-year-old woman with nothing but a wet dress and a few $100s. But he hadn't accounted for the steal in my will. I was the only variable he didn't control, the only person who could intervene before that insurance policy became a death warrant. "I'm coming for you, Martin Steele," I whispered to the empty car. "I'm the variable you didn't account for." Rachel Morrison was 48, but her face was a map of a decade spent in the trenches of grief, her eyes hard and vigilant like a soldier's. She was waiting for me in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Atlanta, a place that smelled of burnt grease and industrial coffee. When I slid into the vinyl booth across from her, she didn't offer a greeting. She looked at me with a hostility that felt like a physical weight, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous tattoo on the laminate tabletop. "If you're here to tell me he's changed or that you've found some peace with that monster, you can turn around and leave right now," she said, her voice like sandpaper. "How do you tell a woman that her sister's killer is currently tucking your grandchildren into bed?" I didn't reach for her hand. I knew she wasn't the type to want a stranger's comfort. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out a stack of photos, Olivia and Ethan smiling on a playground, unaware of the wolf in their house. "I'm here because he's doing to my daughter exactly what he did to your sister," I said, my voice as firm as the iron I'd become. "I'm not his spy, Rachel. I'm his prey, and I'm tired of running." She took the photos, her hard eyes softening just a fraction as she looked at the children. She revealed that she was actually the one who had sent the anonymous tip to the insurance company years ago, a desperate attempt to flag Martin's pattern. That act of defiance was the reason he had been forced to change his name to Sterling to get a new policy for Victoria. "Look at these kids," I urged, leaning closer. "They need a grandmother, not a tragedy. They need us to be the end of his story." The coffee was cold, but the realization was colder. Marcus wasn't just a liar, he was a serial emotional assassin. As I spoke, detailing the isolation Marcus had built around Victoria and the way he had scrubbed my name from their lives, I saw Rachel's posture shift. The hostility evaporated, replaced by a grim, shared recognition. "He doesn't love women, Eleanor," she said, her voice dropping to a low, mournful tone. "He loves their net worth. He finds the ones who are lonely or grieving or just a little too trusting, and he harvests them. I've spent 9 years waiting for him to surface. I thought I was alone in this." "You're not alone anymore," I replied, and the word sisters hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. "We're going to bury him." Rachel didn't just open a folder. She opened a vein, letting 9 years of suppressed justice bleed onto the table. She reached under the seat and pulled up a cold, heavy cardboard box full of paper. It was an archive of agony newspaper clippings from Sandra's funeral hospital records that Marcus had tried to have destroyed, and unreturned letters she had written to her sister that were found in Marcus's old trash. She slammed a specific folder down that made a dull, heavy thud. "This is Sandra's life," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, raw grief. "Every penny he stole, every lie he told. It's all here, but it wasn't enough to convict him. He was too smart, too careful with the forensics." But then she opened the folder to a photo from Sandra's 2007 wedding. I leaned in, the flickering, buzzing yellow light of the diner sign casting long shadows over the table. Rachel pointed to a couple in the background the distinguished elderly man and woman Marcus had introduced as his parents. My heart stopped. I recognized the woman in the photograph immediately. She had toasted my daughter's happiness with a smile that I now knew cost Marcus a flat fee of $500. They were the exact same parents I remembers from Victoria's 2012 wedding photos. "Look at the guest list from their wedding," Rachel said, her finger tracing a name. "Does any of this look familiar?" I wasn't just a woman in a diner. I was a witness with resources, and the evidence was finally emerging from the shadows. Marcus Sterling thought he was the architect of a perfect deception, but he had reused his materials. He had hired the same actors a UPS store family he could buy and discard. I stared at the photo at the fake parents and the doomed bride and realized that Marcus had been playing a long game, but he had left the blueprints for his own destruction in a diner in Atlanta. The transition from grief to war was complete, and as I looked at Rachel, I knew we weren't just survivors. We were the evidence he couldn't delete. I tore the plastic sleeve of the 2012 wedding binder, my fingers trembling, as I compared the Sterling family tree to the list of paid background actors Rachel had provided. The smell of old adhesive in the wedding binder rose up to meet me, a cloying scent that usually signaled a lifetime of happy memories. But tonight it smelled like the sweat of a con man. I had spent 6 years protecting this book, believing it was the blueprint of my daughter's future. Now I realized it was just a catalog of ghosts. I looked at the photograph of the woman I once knew as Marcus's mother, her pearl necklace gleaming under the wedding lights. Rachel's records were indisputable. Not a single blood relative had attended that wedding. Marcus had married my Victoria in a room full of strangers, with scripts people hired to play the roles of aunts, uncles, and doting parents. I traced the addresses listed for these guests in my old records and felt a surge of calculated rage. Unit 402, a mailbox. Every single one of them led back to a single UPS store in Savannah. His entire family history fits in a metal box behind a counter. I whispered into the quiet of my office. I realized then that the anniversary gift Marcus had given Victoria just last month, a series of expensive vitamins in sleek amber bottles, wasn't about health at all. They were mild sedatives designed to keep her in a state of soft, compliant confusion. How do you fight a man who is literally stealing your daughter's mind one vitamin at a time? It was a slow-motion execution, a systematic stripping of her personhood, while she thanked him for his care. I sat in the harsh blue light of the office computer screen, the flickering glow reflecting off my late husband's diamond ring. The transition from grief to war was no longer a metaphor. It was a tactical necessity. The clock was ticking toward a deadline I hadn't even known existed. A soft knock at my office door startled me. James Crawford stepped into the room, his face etched with the weariness of a man who spent his life chasing shadows. He was carrying a stack of intercepted mail meant for Marcus items he had retrieved with a legal gray area efficiency that I no longer questioned. "He's not just spending her money anymore," Eleanor Crawford said, sliding the papers onto my desk. "He's going for the keys to her brain." He pointed to a series of correspondences with a man named Dr. Holloway. Who is Holloway? I asked, the bitter taste of cold, forgotten tea lingering on my tongue. Crawford's eyes were grim. "A psychiatrist who specializes in expedited mental competency evaluations for a fee. He's the one Marcus is using to build the paperwork. Dementia." The words sat on the legal paper like a parasite, hungry and cold. I stared at the draft petition for conservatorship, the crinkle of thin legal paper, sounding like a death rattle in the silence of the room. Marcus was using fake medical reports to claim my 29-year-old daughter was suffering from early-onset dementia. It was the perfect trap. Once he had legal guardianship, he would have total control over her $500,000 insurance policy and every asset she had inherited from Bill. He was manufacturing a crisis to justify his takeover, turning her into a ward of the state under his thumb. "She's 29 years old," I said, my voice rising with a terror I couldn't suppress. "He's telling the state she's a vegetable so he can sign her death warrant." He's manufacturing a crisis to justify his guardianship, and the state will hand her to him because she's drugged enough to look the part. I realized that the sedatives weren't just to keep her quiet. They were the evidence he needed for the evaluation. Every time she forgot where she put her keys or drifted off mid-sentence, he was logging it as a symptom. He was painting a portrait of a broken mind using her own body as the canvas. Marcus wasn't just building a case, he was building a cage, and the bars were made of forged medical ink. I felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of my neck as I flipped to the final page of the medical file Crawford had brought. There, tucked away in the back, was a handwritten note from Dr. Holloway's assistant. It confirmed the date for the final competency hearing. It was scheduled for next month, a legal ambush that Victoria knew absolutely nothing about. I looked at the hearing date. November 14th. I had exactly 28 days to prove my daughter wasn't losing her mind. She was just losing her life to a monster. The clinical cold scent of the medical report seemed to fill the room, a smell that reminded me of hospitals and endings. I realized that I couldn't fight this from a distance anymore. I couldn't be the shadow in the library. I had to become a presence that Marcus couldn't ignore, a force that would command the attention of the court and the city. I needed a base of operations that looked like the power I intended to wield. I needed a fortress. My mind flashed back to a property I had seen on the market, a place that was as old and resilient as the Beaumont name itself. Marcus thought he had planned for everything, but he hadn't planned for a mother who had learned to read a balance sheet like a war map. He had given me a deadline, and I was going to meet it with a fury he wouldn't survive. I looked at Crawford, my steel-willed resolve finally hardening into a weapon. "We have 4 weeks to take him down," I said, "and I know exactly where I'm going to set up the front line." I closed the wedding binder, the snap of the cover sounding like a finality. The woman who had been kicked out into the rain was gone. In her place was the CEO of an empire he had inadvertently funded, and I was about to walk right through his front door. I had 28 days to save Victoria, and I wasn't going to waste another second of them playing by his rules. I kicked through a layer of dust and dried leaves in the grand foyer of the abandoned Drayton estate. The smell of rot and forgotten glory reminding me exactly of the man I was about to dismantle. The light that filtered through the cracked stained glass was thick with motes of decay, but I didn't see a ruin. I saw a stronghold. I had leveraged every penny of my saved $400,000 to acquire this dilapidated historic hall, much to the confusion of the Savannah real estate market. "It's a ruin," they said, their voices full of the condescension I'd grown to enjoy. I told them a ruin is just a house that survived its enemies. What they didn't know was that the Drayton estate was originally owned by Sandra Morrison's family. It was a detail buried under a century of land transfers, a fact I had kept hidden so that Marcus wouldn't suspect the connection to his past. I wasn't just buying a venue for Beaumont luxury events. I was buying a fortress where I could safely coordinate my war. A historic renovation is a lot like a family reunion. You have to peel back decades of wallpaper to find the rot hiding in the studs. As construction began in the summer of 2019, I didn't just worry about crown molding or the integrity of the heart pine floors. While the contractors saw me as a demanding old woman obsessed with period-accurate details, I was actually overseeing the installation of a secret high-tech security room hidden behind the library's false shelves. "I want these walls reinforced," I told the head of the construction crew, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "If a fire starts in the kitchen, I want the rest of the house to feel like an icebox." I walked through the skeleton of the building, the smell of fresh sawdust and expensive white paint beginning to mask the scent of old Drayton failure. Every camera must have a redundant cloud backup, I insisted to the security lead. No blind spots. Do you know what the most expensive part of a house is? It is not the marble or the chandeliers. It's the peace of mind you get when you know your enemies can't get inside. Marcus thought I was still the woman who couldn't protect her own suitcase on a sidewalk, but I was building a cage with gold-plated bars. By August, the mansion had been transformed. I had renamed it Beaumont Hall, a name that carried the weight of my husband's legacy and the steel of my own. The grand opening was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. I stood on the grand staircase, my hand resting on the polished mahogany rail as the hollow echo of footsteps filled the grand foyer. I watched the elite of Savannah trickle in, men in silk ties and women in diamonds, the very people who had whispered about my breakdown years before. Now they were clamoring for my attention. I stood there 75 years old and radiant in a gown that cost more than my first year's revenue, realizing that my public success was the ultimate lure. Success is a loud bell, I thought as I greeted a prominent judge. Marcus will hear it. He won't be able to resist the sound of money, especially now that Crawford's reports show him drowning in gambling debt. "Welcome to Beaumont Hall," I said to a group of local investors, my smile as sharp as a razor. "I hope you find the security as impressive as the silk." I watched the room, waiting for the first sign that the prey had seen the bait. I knew he was watching. Marcus Sterling couldn't stand to see a Beaumont standing tall, let alone one who had acquired a property tied to the woman he'd murdered. Flash. The cameras captured my smile, a perfect mask of a triumphant CEO. But inside, I was already counting the minutes until Marcus tried to burn it all down. I took a sip of dry, expensive champagne, the bubbles stinging my throat, and felt the smooth, cold touch of the brass ribbon-cutting scissors in my pocket. The night was a triumph of logistics and ego, but as the crowd began to thin, I retreated to my private library to find a moment of silence. The room was filled with the scents of a successful event perfume cedar and the faint ozone of the security monitors. On my desk sat a massive arrangement of congratulatory bouquets. I reached out my fingers, grazing the petals, until I saw a small white card tucked into a cluster of roses. There was no name on the envelope. I opened it to find a single dry, dead lily. The sharp, stinging scent of the dying flower hit me instantly, its petals brittle like ash under my touch. It was Marcus's signature. He was a predator who liked to leave a calling card for his victims, a little reminder that he was always in the hallway, always in the shadows. I held the dead lily in my hand, my knuckles white, as I realized the war wasn't just coming. It was already on my doorstep. He knew I was here. And more importantly, he knew I was winning. He didn't realize that I was no longer the woman who feared the dark. I was the person who owned the lights. I walked back to the grand staircase, looking down at the empty foyer. The silence of the mansion felt different now, heavy with the weight of an impending clash. Marcus thought he could intimidate me with a dead flower, but he was about to find out that some things only get harder when they are tempered in the fire. I had the building, I had the reputation, and I had the evidence. Now I just had to wait for him to make the first move. I looked at the security monitors in the library, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, and waited for the night to bring the first strike. The game had moved from the shadows to the stage, and I was the one holding the script. I watched the notification bell on my tablet flash like a siren in the dark, each chime a digital bullet aimed directly at the heart of Beaumont Hall. I had held the dead lily in my hand only hours before its brittle petals, a promise of war, and now the first volley had been fired. I sat in the sprawling library of the Drayton estate, the silence of the massive house amplifying the aggressive pings of the device. Marcus Sterling knew exactly where I was, and more importantly, he knew I was winning. I had spent years building a fortress of reputation, but he was attempting to dismantle it with the surgical precision of a man who moved assets for a living. I reveal now that I had purposely left a minor security vulnerability in my business site's public records, a breadcrumb trail for a predator who couldn't resist a perceived weakness. I wanted him to make a traceable digital mistake. By 3 a.m, the review bomb had fully detonated. I scrolled through the screen, my face illuminated by the cold blue glare of the tablet. 53 fake 1-star reviews had flooded the Beaumont events page within a 3-hour window. The accusations were vile, tailored to hit the precise anxieties of Savannah's high society brides. One claimed I had stolen family heirlooms during a consultation. Another alleged the presence of toxic black mold hidden behind the new plaster. Several others described fabricated safety violations. That would shut down any venue in the state. Mold theft, I whispered to the empty, high-ceilinged room, my voice tight with a controlled fury. He's not even trying to be subtle. He's trying to be lethal. By sunrise, my assistant would be fielding cancellations. We would see a 40% drop in bookings by the time the banks opened. Marcus knew exactly where it hurt, but he didn't realize I was already sitting in the dark waiting for the smoke to clear so I could find his fingerprints. Have you ever seen a lifetime of reputation dissolve in a few clicks? It is faster than ice melting in a Georgia July. I didn't allow myself the luxury of panic. Instead, I called the one person who could navigate the labyrinth Marcus had built. Alex Morgan was 24 with skin that hadn't seen the sun in weeks and an intensity that made me feel like I was watching a surgeon operate on a motherboard. I had met Alex through a contact at the bank, and by 9 in the morning, I sat in my office as the rhythmic clicking of a mechanical keyboard filled the space. The smell of stale coffee and hot electronics began to replace the scent of the Drayton dust. "I don't just want them deleted, Alex," I said, my throat feeling dry and parched after hours of staring at screens. "I want the name on the bill." Alex didn't look up, eyes reflecting lines of code that looked like a foreign language to me. "These weren't sent from a bot farm in Russia." Alex muttered the clicking, never stopping. "The IP is coming from right here in Savannah, a co-working hub." "Good," I replied, my hand tightening on my late husband's diamond ring. Let's see who's hiding behind the screen. We spent the afternoon in that digital trenches. I watched the blue glare of the monitor until my eyes burned, but Alex was relentless. By 2 in the afternoon, the predator finally left a footprint. Alex found a security flaw in the bot farm's payment portal, a sloppy oversight by a man who thought he was too smart to be caught. Broughton Street. He was less than a mile away, breathing my air while he poisoned my name. The realization hit me with a short shock that made my pulse hammer against my ribs. "The payment went through at 2:47 p.m. yesterday," Alex said, leaning back as a map of downtown Savannah appeared on the screen. "It was processed at a co-working hub on Broughton." But here's the interesting part. Alex pulled up a transaction record. Check the name on the card. Does Sterling Logistics Solutions ring a bell? It didn't just ring a bell. It rang a death knell. I recognized that shell company immediately from the records Bill and I had kept of Marcus's past logistics fraud. It was a ghost company he used to move debt, and now he had used it to buy my destruction. But the true irony surfaced a moment later. Alex traced the specific account numbers and found that the credit card Marcus used for the bot farm was actually an old joint account he had opened with my daughter years ago. He had forgotten Victoria still had access to the digital statements, unintentionally leaving a trail for my investigation. Marcus wasn't a chess player. He was a child with a hammer, and I was finally handing him the nails. I felt a grim sense of vindication wash over me, a cold heat that settled in my marrow. Armed with the digital footprints and the link to the shell company, I called my lawyer. By the following morning, an emergency cease and desist was served, and I watched as the 53 vile reviews vanished from the internet like mist. But the victory felt hollow, a temporary reprieve in a battle that was moving from the screen to the physical world. He's desperate, I thought, looking out the window at the sprawling lawn of Beaumont Hall. People like Marcus only resort to digital games when they're losing the real one. Now he knows I have a shield. He'll look for a bigger sword. The vibration of my smartphone on the glass desk startled me, a sharp sound in the sudden quiet of the office. Alex looked up from the monitor, his face suddenly pale, the blue light making him look like a ghost. "Eleanor." "He wasn't just buying reviews," Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "I found the history of the files he accessed through the co-working hub server. He was downloading the architectural blueprints for Beaumont Hall, the full schematics, the electrical, the plumbing, the structural supports, everything." My stomach lurched. Blueprints aren't for business rivals. They're for burglars and arsonists. Marcus Sterling wasn't trying to just ruin my name anymore. He was planning to dismantle the very walls around me. I ignored the smell of smoke for exactly 3 minutes, long enough to ensure the bride had finished her father-daughter dance, unaware that my legacy was already liquefying in the storage room. I had spent the last 2 days in a state of defiant anxiety ever since an anonymous email landed in my inbox. The message was 4 words long: Some things are meant to burn, accompanied by a high-resolution photo of Beaumont Hall's rear entrance. I knew it was from Marcus. It was his signature move, a psychological barb meant to make me flinch, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a cancellation. I had 120 guests arriving for the most expensive wedding of the season, and I was not about to let a ghost from room 104 dictate the terms of my success. I told the security team to double the perimeter checks and ensured no one entered without a badge, but my internal alarm was screaming. By the night of December 14th, 2019, the air in Savannah was crisp, but inside the hall, the warmth of celebration felt fragile. I moved through the ballroom, a shadow in silk watching the periphery. At 8:15 p.m., the first crack in my fortress appeared. A small kitchen fire was reported nothing more than a stray cloth near a burner, but it was enough to draw my lead security guards away from their posts at the rear of the building. I realized the trap too late. As I hurried toward the service corridor, I checked my tablet's security feed and saw a hooded figure slip through the very door Marcus had photographed. My blood turned to ice. I ran toward the main fire suppression room, my heels clicking frantically against the heart pine floors, only to find the door hanging open and the main line severed. "The sprinklers aren't turning on," I shouted into my radio. The smell of accelerant now thick and unmistakable. Someone cut the main line. Clear the ballroom, Shrapaprim. Have you ever seen 100 years of history turn into orange light in under 10 minutes? It makes your own life feel very, very small. I watched the first lick of flame catch the heavy velvet curtains, the fire spreading with a hunger that wasn't natural. Panic is a different beast when it's dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns. I directed the flow of guests toward the front exits, my voice calm even as my lungs began to burn. In the chaos, I discovered a betrayal that cut deeper than the fire itself. The security guard I had hired specifically to watch that rear entrance, a man I'd trusted with the keys to my kingdom, was gone. I found out later he was a former associate of Marcus who had simply looked the other way for an envelope of cash. Silence. Then the windows blew outward. The roar of the fire began to sound like a jet engine, a terrifying rhythmic thrumming that shook the very foundations of the estate. I was almost at the exit when I heard a frantic cry. The bride's mother was screaming that her mother, a frail woman in her 80s, hadn't made it out of the bridal suite. I didn't think. I didn't weigh the risks of my 70-year-old frame against the inferno. Before I reveal the truth behind that technical problem with the sprinklers, are you still with me? Comment trust or run, and add one short reason why you think I went back in. Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes. If you're not comfortable with dramatized conflict, you can stop the video here. I plunged back into the thick black smoke, the heat blistering the skin on my neck. I found the grandmother trapped in a small bathroom, the door jammed by the heat-warped frame. "I can't hear you, dear." "Why is it so dark?" she cried, her voice thin and terrified. I put my shoulder to the wood, ignoring the scream of my own muscles, and broke through. "Hold my hand. Don't let go. We're almost at the door." I wrapped her in my singed silk blazer and led her through a hallway that had become an absolute inferno. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, but we reached the cool night air just as the grand foyer ceiling began to rain sparks. I collapsed onto the grass, the grandmother safe in the arms of her weeping family, while I gasped for air that didn't taste like ash. I watched from the perimeter, my face covered in soot, as the roof of Beaumont Hall finally gave way. The hall wasn't just a building, it was my skin, and Marcus was peeling it off while I was still wearing it. Robert Patterson was a man who looked like he'd been carved out of soot and granite, with a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a drum. He walked toward me as the paramedics draped a yellow blanket over my shoulders. It was accelerant. "Eleanor," he said, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the dying embers. Someone wanted this building gone. They used a professional-grade chemical. I sat in the back of the ambulance, the taste of thick gray soot, heavy on my tongue when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a restricted number. I didn't answer, but the voicemail notification appeared seconds later. I pressed play, hearing the crackle of the fire in the background of the recording, before a distorted voice spoke. "You should have left well enough alone." Some things are meant to burn. I recognized the rhythm of his speech, the arrogant tilt of the words. Marcus thought he had reduced my ambition to a pile of charred wood. He thought that by taking my physical assets, he could return me to the woman on the bus. But as I watched the fire truck spray the skeleton of my dream, a new kind of cold resolve settled in my chest. He had made it personal. He had put my guests and my life at risk for a gambling debt and a grudge. I gripped the singed fabric of my dress, my lungs screaming from the smoke, and looked at the fire marshal. Marcus thought he had reduced me to ash, but he forgot that some things only get harder in the fire. He had just turned my business into a crime scene, and I was going to make sure he was the only one left in the wreckage. I stared at the $800,000 check resting on my kitchen table, the paper still smelling faintly of the smoke that had tried to swallow me whole. I had gripped the singed fabric of my dress while the paramedics treated me, vowing that Marcus Sterling had made a grave error in leaving me alive a second time. He thought he had reduced me to ash, but he forgot that some things only get harder in the fire. Now, less than a month after Beaumont Hall became a charred skeleton, I was looking at the liquidity I needed to finish him. I reveal now that I had actually been scouting the Forsyth mansion for months prior to the fire. I knew the arson was coming the moment I received that dead lily, and I had used the attack as a strategic catalyst to access my insurance liquidity years earlier than planned. I met with the insurance adjuster in a temporary office, my voice steady and my documentation impeccable. The arson investigation was thorough, but James Crawford had already ensured that the trail led directly to the accelerants used in Sterling Logistics warehouses. They didn't flag me, they flagged a liability I intended to collect on. By January 2020, I had combined that payout with my $400,000 in savings, creating a $1.2 million war chest. "Check is cleared," Eleanor Crawford said as he sat across from me, his eyes reflecting a grim satisfaction. "What is the move?" I slid a real estate brochure across the table. "I'm going to buy the crown jewel of Savannah. Do you know what $1 million sounds like when it hits a bank account? It sounds like the silent click of a loaded gun." I didn't want a mid-level office or another renovation project. I wanted the Forsyth Mansion, an $8.5 million testament to Savannah prestige. I viewed the property in February, walking through the 12,000 square feet of old mahogany and beeswax-scented history. I used my business's high revenue projections and the news of my miraculous survival of the fire to secure financing. The structure was complex, but solid at $4. $2 million SBA 504 loan, backed by the business's revenue history. A $2.4 million commercial mortgage secured by the property itself, plus my $1. $2 million in liquid assets, $800,000 insurance payout, plus $400,000 savings. Total $8.5 million for the Forsyth Mansion. The bank loan officer was hesitant, citing the risk. $8.5 million is a lot of risk, Mrs. Beaumont, he said, adjusting his glasses. I leaned forward, the sharp metallic taste of nervous excitement on my tongue. "Then it is a good thing I have spent my life managing high-stakes disasters," I replied. "I am not just buying a house, I am buying a message, and that message is that I cannot be stopped." The terms were aggressive, 6.8% interest, 20-year amortization, with personal guarantees and business collateral. But I had the revenue to support it, $850,000 in 2019 alone, and the projections showed $1.4 million for 2020. More importantly, I had the will to make it work. I closed the deal in record time. Click. The key turned. The Forsyth Mansion was mine, and the Sterling legacy was officially on the clock. I took possession of the keys on February 28, 2020. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, the echoing silence of the house sounding like a long-awaited breath of air. But I wasn't there to decorate. I immediately invested $300,000 into advanced security that Marcus Sterling couldn't dream of bypassing. I oversaw the installation of a high-tech surveillance bunker hidden behind the original 1870 woodwork of the library. If he wants to play with fire, he will find this mansion is made of something much stronger than heart pine. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was the architect of a spider web, and I had just laid the strongest silk in the center. While I was inspecting the mansion's original blueprints in the hidden bunker, I found a detail that Crawford had missed. The previous owners, the family who had held this estate for 50 years, were actually distant relatives of Sandra Morrison. Marcus had been searching for these blueprints not to rob me, but because he believed there were assets or secrets tied to his first wife's family buried in these walls. He thought he was hunting me, but he was really hunting his own ghosts. From $800 to an $8 million crown jewel, I whispered my hand, tracing the heavy, cold weight of the antique brass key. Not bad for a woman who was considered too set in her ways to survive. I sat in the darkened surveillance room watching the high-definition feeds of the perimeter. I was lethally prepared and tactically superior. I knew Marcus would see the news tomorrow. I had already paid for the headline in the Savannah Morning News Cinderella Planner buys historic Forsyth estate. I wanted him to see it. I wanted him to feel the walls of his own debt-ridden life closing in as I ascended to a height he could never reach. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, the echo of my heels sounding like a death knell. Marcus would see the news tomorrow. He saw it sooner than I expected. Just 4 weeks after the headline ran on March 28th, 2020, the security intercom buzzed at 2 p.m. I watched the monitor as Marcus and Victoria stood at my front gate, 2 large suitcases beside them, like props in a poorly rehearsed play. Marcus smiled at the camera, his voice smooth through the speaker. "Eleanor, we saw the news. Congratulations on the mansion. We thought since you have so many empty rooms, we could move in and help you manage things. You're getting older, after all." I stared at the screen, watching Victoria standing silent and hollow-eyed behind him. This wasn't a reconciliation. This was a reconnaissance mission. I pressed the intercom button, my voice cold and clear. "This door is always open for my daughter, but not for the man who's been slowly killing her." Marcus's smile vanished. His voice turned sharp, threatening. "You'll regret this, Eleanor." I watched them leave the suitcases, dragging behind them like failed dreams. I knew then that he would stop using words and start using weapons. And I knew exactly how he would react. He would stop using matches and start using men. He was drowning in gambling debt, and the sight of my success would be the final lure to pull him out of the shadows and into the light, where I could finally destroy him. I looked at the security monitors one last time before heading upstairs. The house felt solid, unyielding, and protective. It was the fortress I had needed back in 2013, but I had been forced to build it myself, brick by bloody brick. The legal war was about to become a physical one. But as I looked at my reflection in the darkened glass of the library window, I didn't see the frightened widow of room 104. I saw a woman who had mastered the logistics of revenge. I was no longer the prey. I was the one holding the bait, and the trap was finally set. The morning light through the stained glass was beautiful, but I didn't linger. I had a meeting that required a very different kind of logistics. I met FBI agent Sarah Blake at an undisclosed government facility on May 10th, 2020. Sarah Blake was a woman whose sharp bob and sharper suit suggested she had spent her life navigating the world's most dangerous boardrooms and back alleys. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She slid a tablet across the table, showing me the digital trail James Crawford had helped her team verify. Marcus had been busy on the dark web conducting searches for untraceable murder-for-hire services. "He's not just looking for a way out of debt anymore, Eleanor," she told me, her voice cold and professional. "He's looking for a way to inherit the Forsyth." I looked at the data and felt a chilling anticipation. The bait was set and the predator was already circling. "Then let's give him the opportunity he thinks he's been waiting for," I replied. We decided to use my public profile as a hook. If Marcus believed I was vulnerable and away from my security-saturated fortress, he would strike. Have you ever played a game where the stakes were your own obituary? It focuses the mind wonderfully. Every movement I made from that moment on was choreographed for an audience of one. On May 14th, I began the Florida Ruse. I posted a series of staged photos on my social media accounts showing me packed and ready for a week-long retreat at a sister's house in Florida. Sun, sand, and no cell service for a week. "See you soon, Savannah," I wrote, knowing Marcus would be monitoring every character. I don't even have a sister, but Marcus didn't know that. He only knew what he could steal, and I was giving him a map to an empty mansion. I publicly announced that Beaumont Hall would be vacant and under maintenance while I was gone, providing the perfect window for what he would assume was a robbery gone wrong. Instead of driving south, I waited until dark and took a cab to a budget hotel only 2 miles away. I checked in under a false name carrying only a laptop and a bag of essentials. The room smelled of stale recycled air and industrial cleaner, a far cry from the mahogany halls of the Forsyth, but it was the perfect observation post. I set up my equipment in the dark, the blue flickering glow of the laptop screen, the only light in the room. I connected to the mansion's hidden 24/7 security feed, the redundant cloud system Marcus didn't know existed. 12,000 square feet of empty bait, I whispered, staring at the grainy black and white images of my foyer. Come on, Marcus, show me your hand. Checkmate. Or so he thought. I sat there for hours, the lukewarm, over-caffeinated coffee tasting like battery acid. Agent Blake had revealed a twist during our briefing. Marcus had contacted a contractor who was actually a federal asset, but he was also communicating with a second, much more dangerous, unvetted source. My pulse hammered against my ribs. The GPS tracker I'd found under my car earlier that day, a small cold magnet I'd left in place to avoid spooking him, confirmed he had been stalking my physical movements for weeks. He thought he was the hunter, but he was walking into a steel trap. I was a spider sitting in a cheap hotel room, feeling the vibrations of a web that spanned the entire city. I watched the clock crawl past midnight. The distant, muffled sound of city traffic was the only companion to the buzzing silence of the hotel. My eyes ached from staring at the monitors, watching the swaying shadows of the oak trees on the Forsyth lawn. Then at 2:14 a.m., the screen flickered with movement. I froze my breath, catching in my throat. A shadow detached itself from the heavy trunks of the oaks. It moved with a practiced predatory grace toward the side entrance. I leaned in my heart, thundering so loudly I thought the guests in the next room might hear it. A second figure followed. They were dressed in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured. They reached the door with the state-of-the-art cylinders I had installed specifically to be breached by someone with the right schematics. On the small screen, the shadow reached out. The front door handle began to turn with agonizing, practiced slowness. I reached for my burner phone to alert Agent Blake, my thumb hovering over the dial. The lock clicked. A sound that shouldn't have been possible echoed through my mind, even though I was miles away. They were inside. The wolves had entered the house, and I was the only one watching them walk into the mouth of the trap. The heavy mahogany door of my mansion groaned as it swung open, and I watched through a grainy lens as 2 men stepped into my foyer, carrying the tools for a murder they thought I wouldn't be present to witness. On the small screen of my laptop, the shadows of the Forsyth estate were replaced by the harsh, clinical reality of an infrared feed. I sat in my budget hotel room, the smell of industrial cleaner and stale coffee grounding me as the heart-pounding dread of the last hour transformed into a cold, lethal focus. The intruders moved with a practiced predatory grace that suggested they weren't mere burglars. Jake was a wiry man with a twitch in his left eye and a collection of tattoos that suggested he had never worked a legal job in his life, while Donald was a broad-shouldered mountain of a man who moved with surprising silence. They were the wolves Marcus Sterling had sent to finish what his arson attack couldn't. I watched as Jake pulled a set of zip ties from a tactical vest, and Donald adjusted the suppressor on a weapon that looked terrifyingly efficient in the monochrome light. Boss said, "Make it look like a robbery gone wrong." Donald's voice crackled through the hidden microphones I'd installed. No witnesses. Jake gave a jagged, nervous laugh. "Old ladies in Florida," he replied, unaware that I was barely 2 miles away. "We got all night to clean up. Check the master suite first. Make sure the safe is open before we leave." Have you ever watched your own death being planned in real time? It is a very grounding experience. It strips away the pretense of polite society and leaves you with the raw, metallic taste of survival. I had anticipated this move. I reveal now that I had my cybersecurity team replace the intruder's burner phone GPS data with a fake loop days ago. Every time they checked their coordinates, the map told them I was still sitting in a beach house in Florida, even as they breached my Savannah foyer. They reached the top of the marble staircase, their boots silent on the carpet I had chosen, specifically for its aesthetic and its sound-dampening properties. I gripped the edge of the hotel desk, my knuckles white. Bang! The flashbangs lit up my foyer like 1,000 suns. The transition was instantaneous. I triggered the mansion's lockdown mode from my laptop, hearing the heavy thud of magnetic deadbolts engaging on every exit. On the screen, Jake and Donald were suddenly bathed in the blinding white-blue glare of tactical flashlights. Federal agents dropped the weapons now. Agent Blake's voice boomed through the hallways, a sound of absolute authority. The wolves were suddenly cornered rats. How did they know he said she was gone? Jake screamed, dropping to his knees as a dozen red laser dots danced across his chest. The steel trap had snapped shut with a precision that would have made my late husband Bill proud. "Eleanor, this is Agent Blake," a voice came through my headset. "We have the package. You're safe." I didn't breathe until I saw the zip ties being replaced by steel handcuffs. Marcus Sterling wasn't a predator anymore. He was just a small man in expensive pajamas, drowning in a flood of blue and red lights. I switched the feed to a secondary link Crawford had established at the Sterling residence. It was 2 a.m. The quiet, manicured street where my daughter lived was suddenly a theater of justice. I watched as police units surrounded the house, their sirens silent, but their lights casting a rhythmic, bruised purple glow over the lawn. Marcus was dragged out onto the driveway, his silk pajamas a mocking contrast to the grit of the pavement. His face was a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into pure, unadulterated rage as he realized his perfect crime had been a public execution of his freedom. "What is the meaning of this? My mother-in-law is in Florida," he shrieked, his voice cracking. A detective stepped into the light, holding a tablet showing the live feed of his hitmen in my foyer. "No, Mr. Sterling. She's been right here the whole time, Marcus. What have you done?" The voice came from the doorway. Victoria stood there, her face pale and her eyes wide with the terror I had seen too many times before. But this time she wasn't looking at me with pity. She was looking at her husband with a dawning, horrific clarity. The exit twist was already unfolding in the back of the cruiser. Jake, realizing the contract was a bust, immediately turned on Marcus during the initial processing. He revealed to the agents that he had a hidden recording on his own burner phone, a recording of Marcus promising a $5,000 bonus if I suffered before I died. The betrayal was complete. Marcus had hired men who were just as hollow as he was, and they were already selling him for a shorter sentence. I sat back in the plastic hotel chair, the adrenaline finally beginning to recede, leaving a hollow, aching exhaustion in its wake. My phone vibrated against my palm like a trapped bird. My thumb hovered over the green icon, my breath hitching as I realized the silence of 7 years was finally about to break. The caller ID made my heart stop. It was Victoria, and for the first time in 7 years, her name wasn't blocked. I had spent a decade building a fortress of spite and success to reach this single moment. The mansion was safe. The predator was in chains, and my daughter was finally calling me back from the grave Marcus had dug for our relationship. I took a trembling breath, the smell of the cheap hotel room suddenly replaced by the imaginary scent of the gardenias in my library. "Hello, Victoria." I whispered, my voice a low bell that bridged the gap of 1,000 betrayals. 7 years of silence didn't break with a scream. It broke with a single trembling syllable that made my $8 million mansion feel as small and fragile as a birdhouse in a storm. We had seen each other only once in those 7 years, that terrible day in March, when Marcus brought her to my door with suitcases trying to move into my fortress. I had seen the drugs in her eyes, the way he controlled her every movement. I had sent them away knowing that if I let them in, I would be enabling his control over her. Now, with Marcus in handcuffs and the truth finally exposed, she was calling me back from the grave he had dug for both of us. The phone vibrated against my palm like a trapped bird as I sat on the edge of the stiff hotel bed. My thumb hovered over the green icon, my breath hitching, as I realized the silence of 7 long years was finally about to break. I pressed the button and held the device to my ear, my knuckles white. "Mom." The voice was faint, jagged, with a raw, hysterical edge I barely recognized as the vibrant girl I'd raised. "Is it true?" they said. "They said he tried to kill you." I closed my eyes, a single hot tear tracing a path through the dust and stress on my face. "I'm here, Victoria. I never left. I've been right here the whole time," I whispered, my voice a low bell that bridged the gap of 1,000 betrayals. She began to sob, then a sound of absolute structural collapse. "He told me you hated us. Mom, I didn't want to come that day with the suitcases," Victoria sobbed. "Marcus forced me. He said you owed me, that you were hoarding money that should be mine. He made me stand there like bait." Her voice broke. "But when you said the door was open for me, just me, I knew. I knew you never stopped loving me. I just couldn't get away from him." I closed my eyes, tears streaming. "I saw it in your eyes that day, baby. I saw you were still in there, buried under his lies." She choked out through the line. "He said you moved away and changed your number, that you didn't want to be a grandmother anymore. He made me believe I was alone in the world." I gripped the phone tighter, the cold rage in my chest flickering into a protective fire. "He lied about everything, Victoria. He didn't just kick me out. He tried to delete me so he could own you. Have you ever felt your soul physically knit back together? It hurts worse than the tearing, but it's the only way to heal." I told her to come to the hotel immediately, giving her the room number under my false name. An hour later, the door clicked open. Victoria stood there, and the sight of her nearly broke the iron resolve I'd spent a decade forging. She was gaunt, her skin sallow under the harsh hotel fluorescent lights, appearing prematurely aged by a decade of psychological siege. Her eyes were wide, darting like a prey animal's. I didn't wait for her to speak. I crossed the room and pulled her into my arms. Empty. That was the look in her eyes, the look of a woman who had been hollowed out from the inside. "You're so thin, baby," I murmured into her hair, smelling the familiar lavender soap she still used, now mixed with the acrid scent of old tears. "What has he done to you?" She just shook in my arms, her shoulders feeling like brittle dry wood. I felt like I was drowning, and he was the only one holding my hand. She whispered into my shoulder. I didn't know he was the one holding my head under. I held her until the shaking stopped, then led her to the small round table where my master investigation folder lay open. I reveal now that the anonymous friend who had called Victoria to tell her about the arrest wasn't a friend at all. It was James Crawford. I had coordinated that call to ensure she reached me before Marcus could use his one phone call from the precinct to gaslight her into silence again. It was the final logistics play of the night, and it had worked. I opened the folder, revealing the jagged truth I had spent years excavating. I showed her the name Martin Steele. I showed her the death certificate of Sandra Morrison and the police reports of the accidental fall. Victoria stared in horror, her breath hitching as she realized her life was a mirror image of a dead woman's. "He wasn't waiting for me to lose my mind, Victoria," I said, my voice steel-willed and firm. "He was manufacturing it." I pointed to the forged medical reports. Crawford had intercepted the documents, claiming she had early-onset dementia. Then I showed her the life insurance policy. $500,000, Victoria read, her voice barely audible. "He thought I was worth more dead than alive." I nodded grimly. "He's a professional, honey. You weren't his wife. You were his retirement plan. His lies were a forest so thick she couldn't see the sun, and I had just handed her the chainsaw." We sat there in the quiet of the 5 a.m. hour, the blue light of dawn beginning to creep through the gaps in the heavy hotel curtains. I reached for her phone. "Let's look at the deep settings," I suggested. Together, we performed a digital exorcism. I showed her how to find the blocked list Marcus had managed remotely. Her eyes went wide as she scrolled through hundreds of undelivered messages and voicemails from me. Years of "Happy birthday," "I love you," and "Please call me," that had never reached her. "Every birthday, every Christmas. You sent these," she asked, her voice trembling. "I never stopped calling," I told her. "He just never let the phone ring." The final blow came when she checked her sent folder and found a draft email she didn't remember writing, a cold, cruel message addressed to me dated 2 years ago. I realized then that Marcus had been ghostwriting her isolation, sending messages as her to drive the final wedge between us. Victoria dropped the phone onto the carpet, her sobbing suddenly replaced by a terrifying, icy stillness. She looked up at me, and for the first time in 7 years, I saw the Beaumont steel in her gaze. He didn't just steal 7 years, Mom. She whispered, her voice as cold as the marble in my foyer. He's the reason I haven't seen my children's real smiles in months. He's the reason I've been living in a graveyard. I took her hand, our fingers interlacing. The legal war was just beginning, but the psychological one was over. Marcus Sterling thought he had won by silence, but he had only succeeded in creating 2 women who had nothing left to fear. The nightmare is over, Victoria. Now we make him pay for every second he stole. She nodded, her face hardening into a mask of vindictive solidarity. Mother and daughter were finally united against the monster that had tried to consume us both. As the sun finally broke over the Savannah skyline, casting a golden light over the room, I knew that Marcus Sterling's world wasn't just collapsing, it was about to be dismantled piece by piece. I gripped Victoria's hand as we ascended the courthouse steps, the white marble gleaming like the teeth of a predator, waiting to swallow Marcus Sterling whole. The Savannah humidity hung heavy, a thick blanket of heat that made the dry, dusty taste of anxiety in my mouth even more pronounced. Victoria was silent, her fingers trembling against mine, but her gaze was fixed forward. We were no longer the victims of the Azalea Motor Lodge or the silent observers of a stolen life. Today, we were the evidence. I wore a heavy silk blazer that felt like a suit of armor, its weight grounding me as we pushed through the heavy oak doors. Inside, the courthouse smelled of floor wax and old wood, a scent of institutional memory and slow justice. We moved toward the front, ignoring the blinding flash of news cameras in the hallway that sought to capture the downfall of the Sterling name. I sat in the back of the courtroom for the first hour purposefully, wearing the same rain-soaked Sunday dress I had been wearing the night Marcus evicted me. I wanted him to see me as his biggest mistake personified a ghost that refused to stay buried. When he was led in, cuffed and wearing a suit that no longer fit his shrinking frame, his eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. For a moment, the arrogance flickered. He looked at the dress, then at me, and I saw the first crack in his polished mask. D.A. Karen Walsh was a woman who spoke in short, sharp sentences that sounded like glass, breaking under a boot. She opened the trial with a blistering statement, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She didn't just talk about the break-in. She laid out the predatory cycle. She displayed a photo of Sandra Morrison next to a photo of me, 2 women targeted by the same man for the same reason. Harvest. Have you ever watched a man's soul shrink in real time? It happens when the lies run out of room to hide. D.A. Walsh pointed at Marcus, her finger like a spear. He doesn't build families. He harvests them, she declared. This man is not a husband, he is a professional parasite who treats human lives like line items on a ledger. I looked at Victoria, whispering, "Look at her, Victoria. Don't look at him." She nodded, her jaw set in a hard line I hadn't seen since she was a child. The first witness was Jake, the wiry hitman with the twitch in his eye. He took the stand with a strange, nervous calm, detailing the $25,000 contract Marcus had offered him. He described the requirements of the job with a chilling detachment that made the room grow cold. He said the old lady was a thorn in his side that needed pulling. Jake testified, his voice flat. He wanted it to look like a robbery, but he was specific. He told me he wanted her to know it was him before she died. Thud. The gavel fell like a guillotine blade as the defense attempted to object. Judge Meadows, a man who looked like he had seen every shade of human depravity, overruled them. Jake then played a recording from his burner phone. Marcus's voice filled the silent courtroom, arrogant and lethal. "I want her death to be slow enough to regret ever crossing me," the recording hissed. "Is that your voice, mister?" Sterling Walsh asked, the silence that followed more damning than any confession. Marcus said nothing, but the rhythmic tapping of his pen on the defense table had stopped. His hands were shaking. By the second day, a forensic accountant took the stand to perform a financial autopsy on the Sterling household. The successful logistics manager facade was systematically stripped away. The jury watched a slideshow of spreadsheets revealing that Marcus had embezzled $180,000 from Victoria's inheritance. Every business trip he had claimed to take was actually a trip to a casino in Biloxi. He had $120,000 in active underground gambling debts. He was 3 weeks away from total insolvency when he hired the gunman the accountant testified. He wasn't just a murderer in waiting. He was a broke fraud who viewed his wife as a life insurance policy. The courtroom was an operating theater, and we were finally cutting out the cancer D.A. Walsh, then called me to the stand. I walked forward with the heavy wedding binder from June 16, 2012. Mrs. Beaumont, you planned your daughter's wedding to Marcus Sterling, correct? Yes, I replied. And looking back, did you notice anything unusual? I looked at Marcus. At the time, no. But looking back with what I know now, I see the entire blueprint of his con. Walsh opened the binder on a display screen projecting the guest list. This wedding had 160 guests, I explained. Marcus claimed he had a large family, but 130 of these names were completely fabricated. Walsh asked, "How do you know they were fake?" "Because my investigator tracked them down. Most of these addresses lead to a single UPS store mailbox. The relatives who showed up were paid actors, the same actors Marcus hired for his first wedding to Sandra Morrison in 2007. Walsh projected side-by-side photos, Sandra's 2007 wedding next to Victoria's 2012 wedding. The same elderly couple appeared in both playing Marcus's deceased parents. These people charged Marcus $500 each to pretend to be his family, I said. Walsh showed the marriage license and the address Mr. Sterling listed here, 847 Oak Street. It's a UPS store, not a home. Finally, Walsh showed the financial breakdown. Who paid for this wedding? My daughter paid every penny, $35,000 from the inheritance she received from my late husband. Marcus contributed exactly $0. I looked directly at Marcus. This wasn't a wedding. It was a business transaction. And you were the only one who knew the price. The jury looked at the side-by-side photos again. 2 women, 2 weddings, 1 predator. Walsh turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Beaumont just handed you the playbook. The afternoon light was fading when D.A. Walsh called her next witness. Rachel Morrison, please take the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Rachel walked forward. She was 48, but grief had carved deep lines around her eyes. She wore a simple black dress and carried a framed photograph. Ms. Morrison Walsh began gently, "Can you tell the jury about your sister?" Rachel's voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Sandra Morrison was my younger sister. She was brilliant, an architect who designed sustainable housing for low-income families. She inherited $450,000 when our parents died in 2006. She wanted to use that money to open her own firm. And then she met the defendant. Rachel nodded, her eyes fixed on Marcus. She met Martin Steele in 2007. He was charming, attentive, everything she thought she wanted. They married within 6 months. What happened to Sandra's inheritance? Gone within 18 months. Rachel's voice hardened. He convinced her to invest in business ventures that didn't exist. He opened credit cards in her name. By 2009, she was $200,000 in debt and had nothing left. Did Sandra try to leave? Yes. Rachel pulled out a document. This is the divorce petition she filed on March 11, 2009. The hearing was scheduled for March 15th. Walsh paused. And when did Sandra die? March 13th, 2009. Rachel's voice broke. 2 days before the hearing, 2 days before she would have been free. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone crying softly in the gallery. Tell the jury what happened that day. Rachel took a shaky breath. Marcus Martin called 911 at 6:47 p.m. He said Sandra had fallen down the basement stairs. When the paramedics arrived, she was already gone. Blunt force trauma to the head. Was there an investigation? A brief one. Rachel's anger was palpable. Martin told police she'd been drinking. He said she was depressed about money. They ruled it accidental within 48 hours. But you didn't believe that. I knew my sister. Sandra didn't drink. She wasn't clumsy. and she was terrified of that basement she never went down there alone. Walsh pulled up a document on the screen. What did you discover after Sandra's death? Rachel's jaw tightened. I found out Martin had taken out a $300,000 life insurance policy on her 6 months before she died. As her widower, he was the sole beneficiary. A gasp rippled through the jury. Did you report this to police? I tried. Rachel's voice was bitter, but there was no evidence of foul play. The case was closed. Martin collected the insurance money, changed his name to Marcus Sterling, and disappeared. Walsh turned to face the jury. Ms. Morrison, why are you here today? Because when Mrs. Beaumont contacted me in 2017, I finally understood. Rachel looked directly at the jury. My sister wasn't the first, and Victoria wasn't going to be the last. Marcus Sterling is a predator who marries women for their money and kills them when they try to leave. She held up the photograph, Sandra, smiling, vibrant, alive. This is my sister. She was 31 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. But Marcus Sterling saw her as a paycheck, and when that paycheck was about to walk away, he made sure she never could. Rachel's eyes locked onto Marcus, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. You took my sister from me. You stole her dreams, her future, her life. But you didn't get away with it. Because Eleanor Beaumont is the woman Sandra never got to be the one who survived you. The courtroom was utterly silent. No further questions, Your Honor, Walsh said quietly. The defense attorney stood, but before he could speak, Judge Meadows held up a hand. I think we've heard enough for today. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. As Rachel stepped down, she walked past Marcus's table. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Victoria reached out and squeezed Rachel's hand as she passed. Rachel squeezed back, tears streaming down her face. 2 women, 2 families, 1 monster. But only one ending where the monster finally lost. That had lived in our house for 7 years. I felt the weight of the silk blazer on my shoulders, a reminder of the empire I had built while he was busy destroying ours. Victoria watched the screen, her face pale as she realized every gift, every vacation, and every word of affection had been funded by the theft of her own future. Disgust replaced her fear, a much more useful emotion for what was coming next. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the high windows, Marcus's defense attorney suddenly requested a sidebar. He looked visibly shaken, his face a pale mask of panic. He had just realized that Marcus had lied to him about the existence of the joint account trail that Alex had uncovered. The attorney whispered frantically to the judge, his hands gesturing toward the files on the table. It was a betrayal Marcus hadn't planned, for the one person paid to protect him was now realizing he was a lost cause. Victoria stood up then, her thin frame radiating a sudden terrifying strength. The bailiff signaled for the next witness, and the room held its breath as she stepped into the aisle. The dry, dusty taste of anxiety was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She walked toward the witness stand with her head held high, the daughter I had raised finally returning to herself. As she passed the defense table, Marcus's eyes met hers, and for the first time in his life, he was the one who blinked. He looked away, his gaze falling to the floor as the weight of 7 years of lies finally began to crush him. Victoria reached the stand and turned to face the room, her voice a low bell that was about to silence the man who had tried to erase her. I didn't look at the jury as I took the stand. I kept my eyes locked on Marcus Sterling, watching the sweat bead on his upper lip as he realized I was no longer the silent victim he'd left in the rain. Victoria had just finished her testimony, her voice a low bell that had silenced the room, and now it was my turn to hammer the final nail into the coffin of his freedom. I felt the sharp, stinging wood of the witness stand railing beneath my palm, a physical anchor, as I prepared to recount the 7-year journey from that motel room to this courthouse. I took a steadying breath, the air smelling of floor wax and the cold finality of the law. I began by describing the night of the eviction, the weight of $847 in my purse, and the calculated digital execution Marcus had performed to erase my existence. But the most chilling moment came 7 years later in March 2020. By then I had built a multi-million-dollar business and purchased the Forsyth Mansion. When the news broke, Marcus saw an opportunity. DA Walsh pulled up security footage on the courtroom screen. Mrs. Beaumont, can you describe what happened on March 28, 2020? I took a breath. Marcus and Victoria appeared at my door with suitcases. He said they wanted to reconcile. He said I had so many empty rooms, surely I could let families stay. What did you do? I refused. I knew from Crawford's investigation that Marcus owed $120,000 in gambling debt. He wasn't coming to reconcile. He was coming to access my bank accounts. Walsh played the security footage. The courtroom watched as Marcus's polite mask crumbled into rage on my doorstep. Marcus's voice from the recording echoed through the courtroom. I'll be back, Eleanor. And when I am, it won't be to ask permission. And did he come back? Walsh asked. Yes. 2 weeks later, he hired 2 men to break into my home and kill me. The jury stared at Marcus with undisguised horror. You turned him away from your home, Walsh said, and he responded by trying to have you murdered. Yes. I spoke of the Azalea Motor Lodge, the smell of industrial bleach, and the note he'd left threatening to have me institutionalized. I made sure to address him directly, watching his face pale as I exposed the cowardice behind his logistics empire. You didn't just throw me out like garbage, Marcus. I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. You gave me the freedom to become your worst nightmare. I am the evidence you couldn't delete, and I am the mother's love you were too arrogant to account for. Have you ever felt the exact moment a man's power vanishes? It's as quiet as a falling leaf and as heavy as a mountain. I saw it happen in his eyes as I mentioned the name Martin Steele. I turned to Judge Meadows and provided the missing links Crawford had unearthed, the fake resumes, the stolen identities, and the systematic harvesting of women's inheritances. Look at me when I speak to you, Martin Steele, I commanded. Under the weight of my words and the mountain of digital evidence D.A. Walsh had presented, the predator finally snapped. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor, a sound that made the bailiffs tense instantly. You should be dead, he screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated sociopathy. You're just a useless old woman who wouldn't stay in the dirt. I watched him with a clinical detachment as he began to rave, his carefully constructed facade dissolving into a puddle of rage. She was mine, he yelled, gesturing toward Victoria. Everything she had belonged to me by right. It was a full-blown confession delivered in front of a stunned jury and a court reporter who didn't miss a single syllable. Get him out of my courtroom. Now Judge Meadows roared. The bailiffs tackled Marcus, dragging him from the room, while he continued to shriek insults at the woman he thought he had destroyed. Silence. The jury didn't even need an hour. When they returned on November 5th, the atmosphere in the room was heavy with the scent of impending justice. Marcus was led back in now, looking like a hollow shell, his eyes darting toward the exits. The verdict was a rhythmic drumbeat. Guilty, 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 12 times over. Judge Meadows didn't show a flicker of mercy. He looked at Marcus and told him he was an irredeemable predator, a danger to every woman he encountered. I sentence you to a total of 128 years in state prison. The judge declared the words, falling like stones into a deep well. Additionally, based on the evidence presented by Ms. Rachel Morrison and the defendant's own admission during his outburst, I am ordering the immediate reopening of the Sandra Morrison murder investigation. If convicted in that case, you will serve a concurrent life sentence without the possibility of parole. The judge looked at Marcus with undisguised contempt. You will be remanded to Georgia State Prison immediately. Your earliest possible parole date, should you live that long, would be in the year 2148. Marcus's face went white. The bailiffs moved forward, but Judge Meadows wasn't finished. Let me be clear, Mr. Sterling, or should I say Mr. Steele, you are not a husband. You are not a businessman. You are a serial predator who targeted vulnerable women and harvested their lives for profit. This courtroom has seen many criminals, but few as calculated and remorseless as you. The judge's gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the chamber. Court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the exits. Victoria collapsed into my arms, sobbing with relief. Rachel Morrison stood in the gallery, her hand over her heart, finally witnessing the justice her sister never received. Marcus was led away in chains, his expensive suit looking shabby under the harsh courtroom lights. As the heavy door closed behind him, I heard the distant sound of the prison transport van starting up in the courthouse garage. The predator had finally been caged. Outside, the Savannah afternoon was bright and warm. Camera flashes exploded as we descended the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions, but I kept walking Victoria's hand firmly in mine, Rachel on her other side. D.A. Walsh gave a brief statement to the press. Today, justice was served not just for Victoria Sterling and Eleanor Beaumont, but for Sandra Morrison and every woman who has ever been targeted by a predator like Marcus Sterling. This verdict sends a clear message: you cannot hide behind a fake name, a charming smile, or a manufactured life. The truth always comes out. That night, the local news led with the story: logistics manager sentenced to 128 years for elaborate murder-for-hire plot. Marcus's mugshot filled the screen, no longer the polished executive, but a hollow-eyed criminal facing more than a century behind bars. I felt Victoria's hand slip into mine, her grip strong and steady. "Mom, we're finally free." She whispered, the salty taste of happy tears on her cheek. I watched the guards lead Marcus away, hearing the heavy, metallic thud of a prison van door closing in the courtyard below. The man who had tried to steal our history was now a footnote in his own. By December, the Forsyth mansion had been transformed. The smell of roasted turkey and sage filled the grand dining room, replacing the sense of renovation and war. The mansion wasn't just a fortress anymore. It was a heart beating again for the first time in years. I stood at the window for a moment, watching the sparkling gold of the Christmas tree reflection against the glass. The Savannah winter was mild, but inside the warmth was absolute. Victoria was laughing in the kitchen with Olivia and Ethan, a sound that Marcus had tried to silence forever. I sat down at the head of the long mahogany table, the same recipes Bill had loved, spread across the white linen. "To new beginnings," Victoria said, raising her glass, "and to being together." I looked at my grandchildren, seeing their real smiles, the ones Marcus had claimed were gone. "I think your grandfather would be very proud of us," I said, my heart full of a peace I hadn't known since 2013. I reveal now that I have already used the first portion of Marcus's seized assets to set up a trust fund for Rachel Sandra's sister. It was a strategic gift, a way to ensure that Marcus's crimes finally paid for the peace he had stolen from her family. As I watched the kids open their gifts later that evening, the golden light of the fire dancing on their faces, I realized the legal war was over. The predator was behind bars, the inheritance was secure, and the Beaumont name was restored to its rightful standing. But as the clock struck midnight, I looked at the divorce papers resting on the library desk. The work of reclaiming our name was just beginning, and I knew that the next year would require a different kind of strength, not for battle, but for building the legacy Marcus had failed to burn down. Watching Victoria strike through the name Sterling on her driver's license application felt like watching a captive bird finally learn how to sing its own name again. We sat in the quiet, sterile environment of the government office, but to me the air felt as charged as the night I first stepped back into the Forsyth mansion. The legal war was over. The predator was caged, and the serene victory we celebrated at Christmas had transitioned into the slow, steady work of building a legacy. Reclaiming a name is harder than losing one, but Victoria handled the paperwork with a steel-willed focus that mirrored my own. I watched her hand grip the heavy silver fountain pen, her signature bold and clear. "It's not just a name, Mom," she whispered as we walked out into the hazy Savannah sunlight. "It's a shield." The first year of freedom was the hardest. We started family therapy with Dr. Michelle Brooks. The sessions were in my library, the afternoon sun warm as we unpacked years of manipulation. By March 2021, the divorce was finalized. Victoria legally changed her name back to Victoria Beaumont that same month. In August 2021, Victoria moved into her own apartment 3 miles from the mansion. She got a job at an art gallery. By 2022, she was promoted to manager. That Christmas, Victoria met Daniel Cooper, a 38-year-old architect with kind eyes. He courted her slowly, respectfully. When I met him for Christmas dinner 2022, I saw immediately that this was a man who valued Victoria for who she was. By mid-2023, Daniel proposed. Victoria came to me, her face filled with joy and fear. I want to get married again, Mom, but I'm scared. I cupped her face. You're not the same woman who married Marcus. You're stronger, wiser, and you have an army behind you now. On June 14th, 2024, 12 years after her first wedding, Victoria stood before the mirror in my bridal suite in a simple, elegant dress. I adjusted her veil. Thank you, Mom, she whispered, for never giving up on me. Never, I replied. Not once, not ever. The ceremony was in the mansion garden at 4 p.m. Only 40 guests, no paid actors, just real family and friends. As I walked Victoria down the aisle, she held my arm tight. You're safe now, I whispered. He's a good man. I know, Mom, she said. I finally know what real love looks like. Their vows were heartfelt. Daniel, I promise to honor you, respect you, and never make you choose between me and your family. Victoria, I promise to trust again, to love fully, and never forget the people who saved me. She glanced at me. I saw Rachel Morrison in the audience, tears streaming. This wasn't just Victoria's redemption, it was Sandra's vindication. Later, we had the mother-daughter dance to What a Wonderful World. We did it, Mom, Victoria whispered. We survived him. No, baby. We didn't just survive him, we buried him. And now we're free. Ash. That's all that's left of Marcus Sterling's legacy. We are the fire that survived. The story returns to the present day, February 2025. I stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my library, the golden, hazy light of a savanna sunset, bathing the room in a warmth that feels like a benediction. I am 75 years old and my net worth has climbed to $10 million. But as I look at the heavy silver fountain pen on my desk, I realize the numbers are just a ledger of my survival. Beaumont Luxury Events is no longer a one-woman operation run from a motel room. We now employ 47 full-time staff members. We operate 3 premier venues, the rebuilt Beaumont Hall, the Forsyth Mansion, and a new waterfront location we opened in 2024. Last year, we coordinated 180 weddings and generated $2 million in revenue. In December 2024, we received the Top Wedding Planner in Georgia Award from the Southern Events Association. The same organization that once whispered about my breakdown now celebrates my success in glossy magazines. But the numbers aren't what matter most. Wealth is the sound of family laughter in a house that was built on spite but finished with love. Olivia, now 15, works part-time managing our social media accounts. She's a natural marketer with an eye for aesthetics that rivals mine. Nana, can we look at the profit margins for the spring gala? She asks, leaning over the mahogany desk with a sharp eye for detail that makes me smile. She's already talking about studying business in college and one day taking over the company. Ethan, 13, has discovered a passion for photography. He shadows our event photographers on weekends learning composition and lighting. His bedroom walls are covered with prints of weddings, sunsets, and candid family moments. The sound of his camera shutter clicking nearby snaps me back to the moment Ethan capturing the sunset, the flashes of light reflecting in the library glass. Victoria thrives as the gallery manager, earning her own 6-figure salary. She and Daniel are talking about buying a house together, a real home, built on trust and respect, not lies and control. Marcus Sterling remains in Georgia State Prison, inmate number 847293. His first parole hearing, should he live that long, is scheduled for February 2148, 123 years from now. His appeal was denied in June 2022. The Sandra Morrison murder investigation remains open, but prosecutors are confident they have enough evidence for a conviction when it goes to trial in 2026. I receive letters occasionally from other women who've survived predators like Marcus. They find my story online and reach out asking how I survived, how I rebuilt, how I kept fighting. I tell them all the same thing: you are not what he said you were. You are not broken or crazy or worthless. You are a survivor, and that makes you stronger than he could ever be. I was a dormant seed pressed into the mud, and now I am the forest. I look out toward the city, thinking of the long road from the Azalea Motor Lodge. I reveal one final secret: I purchased the original motel site 2 years ago. I tore down the mold-covered walls of room 104 and built a shelter for elderly women facing homelessness. I made sure the ground was consecrated with hope, ensuring that no woman would ever feel as discarded as I did on that rainy night in 2013. I think of Marcus rotting in a cell where the only thing he owns is a number. He thought he could delete me, but he only succeeded in making me the author of my own history. The world tried to throw me away like yesterday's garbage. They didn't realize I was the kind of treasure that only shines brighter under pressure. I feel Victoria's hand squeeze mine as she joins me at the window, our interlaced fingers, a testament to a decade of war and a lifetime of love. The weight of the diamond on my finger no longer feels like a burden of the past. It's a symbol of the strength required to rebuild a life from the gutter. I look at my daughter, my grandchildren, and the empire I built out of broken flowers and iron-willed resolve. I have managed the logistics of my own salvation, and the result is a peace that no predator can ever breach. My name is Eleanor Beaumont. I am 75 years old. I am a mother, a grandmother, and the CEO of a life that was meant to be silenced. If you are sitting, as I finish telling you this in February 2025, I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing it because someone needs to hear that survival is possible. To mothers cut off from your child, don't stop fighting. Keep the door open. I left voicemails for 7 years. Victoria never heard, but they proved I never gave up to abuse survivors. It wasn't your fault. Victoria spent 7 years thinking she was the problem, but you can break free. Reach out. Tell someone. To mothers-in-law who see warning signs, trust your instincts. Don't stay silent to keep peace. I stayed quiet during that first wedding. That silence nearly cost Victoria everything. To anyone starting over, you're never too old to rebuild. I was 63 with $847. Now I'm 75 with a $10 million empire. To those seeking revenge, seek justice instead. I didn't destroy Marcus, he destroyed himself. Focus on building your life, not ruining theirs. This story isn't about money, it's about worth. For 7 years, Marcus treated me like worthless garbage, but our worth isn't determined by how others treat us. I never met Sandra Morrison, but I think about her every day. She didn't get a second chance. But because of Sandra, because Rachel never stopped investigating my daughter, is alive today. Sandra's death saved my life and Victoria's life. So I honor Sandra by living fully. Every wedding I plan, I think Sandra should be here. Rachel gave me Sandra's photo last year. I keep it in my library next to Victoria's. 2 women who look so similar who suffered at the hands of the same monster, but with 2 very different endings. Sandra, if you're listening, we didn't let him win. We buried him. For you. It's been 11 years, 4 months, 12 days since Victoria threw me out. 4 years, 3 months since Marcus was sentenced. 8 months since I walked Victoria down the aisle to a man who deserves her. I'm grateful. Grateful for the pain because it made me stronger. Grateful for the struggle. Grateful for the betrayal because it taught forgiveness. Grateful for the fire because I rose from the ashes. Would I do it all again? Hell no. But would I trade the woman I've become? Never. In your own room, 104. Right now, listening to the buzz of a dying neon sign, remember my story. The door might be locked from the outside, but you are the one holding the blueprints to the exit. I stood in the rain once, but now I own the sky. I look back at my desk at the plans for the next shelter and I smile. The legacy isn't the money or the mansion. The legacy is the fact that we are still here and we are finally beautifully loud. I used to believe love alone could hold a family together. I was wrong. Looking back, my life became a painful family drama story, then a cautionary family drama story, and finally the kind of family drama story people whisper about when trust is broken beyond repair. Don't be like me. Don't ignore the quiet signs. Don't surrender your independence and never let anyone erase your voice. My journey turned into one of those family revenge stories you hear about, then a darker family revenge stories lesson, and ultimately a living example of family revenge stories shaped by survival, not hatred. I didn't rise to destroy, I rose to protect what still mattered. And through it all, I learned this: justice without wisdom is empty, but pain with purpose can rebuild a life. I thank God for giving me the strength to stand back up when everything tried to bury me. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were in Eleanor's position, forced out and erased by your own family? Share your perspective below. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Please note, while inspired by real-world themes, some elements have been dramatized for story.
Thanks for watching all the way thought. I really appreciate you being here. I will see you in the next time.